Welcome to this podcast for the Women in Sport and Exercise Academic Network. I am your host, Dr. Jackie Forsyth, and also co-founder of the network, the purpose of which is to grow, strengthen and promote research on women in sport and exercise with the ultimate goal of optimising women's athletic success and their participation. With these podcasts, we wish to bring you information from leading academics, experts and practitioners involved in research or work with women in sport and exercise, so providing you with advice and support for your research and activities, as well as advice on exercise and performance improvement for women. Please follow this podcast for future updates. I had Dr. Ross Julian on the Wise On podcast. Ross was someone who I had only ever communicated with via email, having read his papers on the effect of menstrual cycle on performance indicators in women's football, because at the time I was doing a project in this area. Ross contributed to 3 chapters in a book that I co-edited with Claire Marie Roberts. I feel like I'm hogging the limelight here and just talking about my past research. But even if this is not your research area, I think Ross is a great podcast guest because he's a UK citizen working and living in Germany. And I'm always intrigued by anyone who moves countries in the pursuit of a career, probably because I've never done it, but always wanted to. So I'm interested in how they did it, what they think about it, and what the differences they think between the 2 countries are. On top of that, Ross has been working collaboratively with others in his department on sex differences in cognitive performance, and I was really intrigued by this research. Okay, so Ross, I actually met you initially because I was doing a project on women's football and menstrual cycle, and actually at the time there was not that much research in that area. So your name was one of the names that came up because you had 2 publications in that area. What was it that got you into that area initially? Was it because you found a difference in your applied work or in your research work, or was it a general interest?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would probably say it's more of a general interest. I've always been interested in women's football as a whole. Being an Arsenal fan, our women's team was very successful when I was young growing up, so I got really into women's football. And then during my master's degree, I actually, for my master thesis, collected data working with premenopausal women and using small-sided games to improve just metrics of health. And I really enjoyed working with females and women and doing research with them. And then after I worked for a little while, there was actually just an opportunity for a PhD in Germany, which was just physical and physiological profiling of women's football. The broadest title you can probably imagine. And I sat there and I thought to myself at the time, okay, what is the biggest difference between males, females in terms of physiology or things that are physical in terms of football? And then I thought a little bit about the menstrual cycle and about the sex-related hormones. And I started delving deep to try and research it in football. And I actually found, to my surprise, at how little or almost no information was available in terms of the research. And I thought this could be an interesting avenue to look down. So I just started doing that more from, not necessarily having deep knowledge, but just thinking this is a vast difference and we should have more information about it. And then the more I started researching about the sex hormones and their effects, and then also how different aspects of the menstrual cycle, not just the physical and physiological, but also the psychobiological, etc., I got really passionate about it. And then luckily was provided with the opportunity to complete my PhD, and then started researching it and actually being able to put what I found interesting into research, and then hopefully started a little bit of traction in this topic. So I see since my initial research, there's been lots done. I won't call myself a pioneer or anything like that, but I'm really happy to see that we're actually focusing a lot more on that in the women's football space.
And with your PhD, were you doing applied work? Were you actually going into football clubs, or was it research driven? In other words, you were trying to find people to come and do your research, or were they already there, the people that you were testing on?
Yeah, so I actually did my PhD in Saarbrücken in Germany, the Institute for Sport and Preventive Medicine, with Professor Tim Meyer, and he was the medical doctor of the German national team, and now he's working for UEFA. I did all the testing, measuring the hormones, then provided, of course, some feedback and information on how they can implement this or things they need to consider. So I wasn't directly applied practitioner. I am more of a researcher, but I managed to go in and work with the teams a little bit more closely than someone who just brings the odd athlete in, does a little bit of testing, and then doesn't see them anymore. So a little bit in the middle, I kind of say.
And I know those two studies, I think, which were probably from your PhD. So one, I think, was on various performance type tests, and the other
Correct.
one was more GPS type analysis. Was
Correct.
that part of your PhD? And did you do any other testing as well, or any other studies?
Yeah, so that was two of my key studies that I did for my PhD. I also initially looked at just variations in performance in tests over multiple measurements, just to see in general if we keep seeing differences in all these different test response from women footballers. And then, of course, after that, put more of the menstrual cycle just on physical testing, and therefore trying to go one step deeper. So we're looking at when testing, and then how does this translate to match play? And that's when we looked at the stuff in terms of the GPS metrics and doing the GPS. And then following that, looked at some research with injury in female football. And then, of course, continued to be interested in working with it's quite popular now, but doing quite a lot of the questionnaire data, trying to see what the perceived aspects are in terms of performance changes, negative or positive in the menstrual cycle, and how that's implemented into the daily practice of football. So I'd say that was more of the research I've done in the menstrual cycle field afterwards.
So, as well, in our book, so our women's football book,
Yeah.
you kindly contributed to 3 chapters. Wow, you're all over it. One of which you led, which was on menstrual cycle and monitoring. And within that chapter, it talks about how difficult it is to convince stakeholders of the need to monitor menstrual cycle because of things like time pressures, resources, funding, and other priorities that are going on within the women's game. If there was one thing that you would say, based on your research, that would convince relevant stakeholders to do this thing, to monitor menstrual cycle, what would it be?
So ironically, I'm going to say from my research, I wouldn't necessarily say, from my empirical studies or anything, that there's overwhelming evidence to say that performance is affected across the menstrual cycle. We've also seen, I know you've had Kelly McNulty on the podcast as well before, and her meta-analysis also indicated that in terms of performance, there seems to be very trivial effects, if any. But we do see a lot of the times the well-being and the perception to be one of the big factors that plays a role. And then, as you mentioned, I contributed to the book, and in the book I talk a lot about attendance and adherence to training. And this is something which I feel should be something that we could try and use this to improve stakeholder buy-in, and trying to explain to them that, okay, although you might not see these direct performance effects due to being in a certain phase, certain hormone concentration, female athletes do report to having symptomology, which can be quite severe and debilitating, meaning that they might not attend training, which means they're not going under the sufficient load that's been planned in terms of their prescription and, meso microcycles. Same with the adherence. So just because you say, okay, they're here at training, this is a load you're going to do, potentially they can't perform that due to some of their symptoms. And so therefore, they could still be then underloaded, or might be times in which they could increase vulnerability for injury, things like this, because they've not been able to do the training load and go through the perceived load that they're going to go under. So I feel like it's more of a health and well-being holistic approach, and kind of saying, okay, might not see these performance deficits, but when we look at not being able to complete training, be there at all, or be at the intensity that was expected, or prescribed, then that might still open up opportunities where they become underloaded or opportunities for increased risk of injury, and looking at it in that front. That's where I see it more so than my direct research results.
And are you still actively involved in this area?
Yeah, so I'm still actively involved in the area. I work with a few clubs that I help with a little bit of consultancy, so also trying to conduct some research with them and trying to help the way in which they implement the menstrual cycle into their practice. Being here at the University of Munster, there's not too many local clubs, women's football clubs, but I'm trying to continue the research in that area. But of course, as time progresses, also looking at other areas and avenues of research as well. But I'm always passionate about this, and also wanting to continue looking at the more attendance and adherence to training, and of course, reducing injury risk.
What do you think about the future scenario then in women's football, considering new technologies, new developments in the area, and considering your interest in both the physical and physiological profiling, but also understanding perceptions and training availability? Where do you think the future is going to be in this area?
So of course, I'm going to think of things that's a dream scenario that could happen, but just as times developed, first of all, you couldn't monitor what the athletes were doing directly with real-time feedback, and then we got GPS, and GPS that can give real-time feedback. It would be great to have real-time feedback on hormonal fluctuations or the concentrations that's in directly on that day, making little clustered groups with where they are in their cycle, with how much hormones, with their symptoms, and almost using it as GPS. And when you're working with return to play athletes or people in the red zone, for example, you're saying to them, okay, you have this marker to hit in terms of high intensity distance, then we need to bring it back because we don't want to increase the risk of injury or things like this. And being able to have this informed decisions using direct real-time information on hormone, coupled with, of course, symptomologies and their well-being markers, and then being able to tell them when they can push, when they might need to pull back, we need to change the demand of training slightly, if we need to provide a different nutritional recovery strategy on that day, for example. These are the sorts of things which would be, of course, it's a little bit maybe fantasy. I don't know if it's something in the future can be done, but this is what I would love to be able to see from my interest and from the research.
Do you see anybody doing that in Germany or elsewhere, or heading towards that utopia?
So I've seen some sorts of devices that supposedly coming out or trying to be created in Germany. I haven't seen too much in terms of that real-time measurements, etc. But definitely the incorporation, at least, of tracking the menstrual cycle and looking at symptomology, etc. That's being brought into the forefront a little more in the women's football here in Germany. But I haven't seen too much in Germany anyway of this kind of real-time hormone and getting direct response. I know that there are hopefully some things bubbling under the surface, but I haven't seen any here in Germany now.
And you mentioned you're doing other types of research as well. And I noticed something that you were doing recently, which was about cognitive performance, sex differences in cognitive performance. Can you say a little bit more about that and your findings?
Yeah, sure. So this is not my main area of research. So cognition, I'm not a cognition expert, but here at my department where I work at, which is called neuromotor behavior and exercise, we have lots of experts in the field of cognition and cognition across the lifespan. So it's basically utilizing my kind of knowledge and understanding of hormone responses and looking at hormones and looking at sex differences, and linking it with researchers here that are experts in cognition and aging, of course. And the results basically showed us we use some confirmatory factor analysis to group different tests into cognitive domains. So we looked at executive functioning and memory. And then we looked at males and females in terms of their responses in certain tests and seeing if they were good in executive functional memory and comparing males versus females. And then also taking hormones. So we had salivary estrogen and testosterone. And of course, we assumed, or we hypothesized, especially in terms of executive functioning and memory, that females would be greater. And that's because of estrogen, and we've seen some previous links to this. But of course, when we did our mediation analysis, that was not the case. And that's of course going to be the case because of menopause, meaning when subjects are 80 plus or 80, they're not going to have the estrogen concentration that they had when they were younger, of course. So we didn't see directly these mediation between the estrogen and testosterone, but we did still find that females outperform males in both executive functioning and memory. And we account this, of course, to longer term development across the lifespan. And we're thinking that some of the exposure to estrogen over the lifespan would have helped with that. And of course, other social factors and environmental factors will come into play with that. But that was, a different type of research for me, but nonetheless, I found it really, really interesting. It was nice to work holistically with other people and hear how my colleagues who work in cognition, how they think, how they work. It was nice to try and bring different expertise together at school.
And what research have you got currently or on the horizon that you're just about to do or you're aiming to do because you're maybe applying for some funding?
Yeah, so students that I work with very closely, we just did a narrative systematic review, I'd like to call it, looking at injury across the menstrual cycle. And the reason why I mentioned this is, and people probably hearing me say that straight away will go, well, there's lots done on injury in the menstrual cycle. And of course, I'll say there's a lot of research done, primarily ACL injuries, which we know are the most burdensome. And there's, of course, reasons for that, also the stress in the media, etc. But what we found during our little systematic review search is that actually in muscular injuries, we could only find 3 papers or 4 papers that actually investigated muscular injuries, which occur a lot more often, although of course not so burdenless as ACL injuries. So we would like to continue doing some research more on these muscular injuries across the menstrual cycle in relation to hormones, and try as much as possible. You don't want players to ever get injured, but to look at this more prospectively rather than retrospectively, where we're trying to fit them into where they might have been in their cycle without being able to measure things more accurately. So we're getting some collaborations with some German clubs here, and then trying to be able to do this on a more prospective way. I don't know how long that will take. We need quite a few injuries, etc., but that's one area that we're looking at. And then, as you mentioned before, in terms of my cognitive research, I'm very interested in sex differences. So one of the things that I'm writing and hopefully going to be researching soon is looking at sex differences in acute responses to exercise, and looking at this multiple time points where they have different concentrations of hormones. So we're going to look at, for example, females across the menstrual cycle, but not necessarily always looking at these distinct time points, because the transitional times are also ignored. So we're just going to look at it at just regular time points with just measuring the hormone concentration. We're also going to have those that have, for example, some menstrual dysfunction, see their hormone concentrations. Also, for example, polycystic ovary syndrome, and see their hormonal concentrations, and also look at males and look at not only how they respond to exercise, but whether the concentrations of those hormones, how much of a role that would play. And hopefully, funding permitted, will bring in some metabolomics as well to get an even more holistic approach to the responses to exercise. Yeah, this is kind of the area or 2 main research topics that I'm looking to do in the not so distant future.
Sounds fantastic. What about the mechanisms that link, you talked about muscular injuries and hormonal levels, but also the cognitive area that you're looking at and hormones? Have links been established?
Yes, there have been, but as most of the research, it's more correlational and this so causational. So this is one of the main reasons for my latter piece of research, looking at the sex differences, to do more of this basic research and trying to look at it on a more mechanistic and more causational level, rather than just looking at some of these correlations. So of course, I'm not going to be going into nitty gritties with the molecular biology, but looking at a vast array of hormonal patterns and concentrations might be able to look in terms of some of these responses a little bit more mechanistically. So again, a lot of the research, like I said, found that, let's just talk about cognition quickly, the females outperform males, especially in verbal based tasks. And then once females have greater estrogen concentrations, the relationship is there between improved performance and estrogen. And again, we don't know if it is because of estrogen or other biological factors, social factors, educational factors, social economic factors. That's all of it comes into it together, but we do see these causal links together. So that's where they're coming in. So to try and look at things a bit more mechanistically. Hence as well with the injury research, prospectively rather than retrospectively. But yeah, we'll see how that all works out.
So it's obvious to see the link with injury, that obviously you're going to do it because you want to avoid injury. With the cognitive area, I mean, I'm sure there's a huge impact for that, because would that have implications on treating individuals with, you said PCOS, or with abnormal hormonal profiles in order to improve cognitive aspects?
That's a great question. I have read lots of studies that's, looked at using HRT once they've hit menopause to help maintain cognitive capacities, and it seems to help with the reduction in cognition towards when they're getting older. Also, there's lots of links to things like dementia and Alzheimer's with hormonal concentrations, but I must admit, I can't confidently answer that question.
But I'm sure somebody can, so who knows, they might get in contact with you and you can do something collaborative.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We've touched a little bit on your work in Germany, and when you said, oh, I took this PhD opportunity, that is a big move, isn't it? And you told me you couldn't speak the language, and then to do something that you'd never done research on, and to embark on a PhD, which is a step already that some people might find difficult to take because they might be thinking, oh, it is a PhD for me. So tell me all about that. Was that such a big move, or was it just the obvious decision at the time for you?
When you break it down like that, it does sound pretty crazy. I've never really thought about it like that. It was almost just a few situations occurred at once. So, for example, I was working as a physiologist and I felt it very repetitive and I wanted to do something different. And I looked at my emails from University of Exeter where I did my master's, and at the top was just an email from my old master supervisor which said a PhD opportunity could fit you, Ross. And I just read it and I had about a week to apply for the PhD, and it was in Germany. And I thought, right, let's do some reading, let's do some initial thoughts, and then just apply. Why not? There's no harm. Then I had an interview, and then I got offered the position. And then I just never looked back. So it was a little bit, kind of spontaneous. But yeah, because I found the topic so interesting when I did my quick research. And of course, I've read astronomically since then, but I found it so fascinating, so interesting. Another country, why not? I think sometimes it's good to experience other cultures, other nationalities, get out of your comfort zone and try something new. With the language, if I'm completely honest, it did say that German was not necessary in terms of doing the PhD. In hindsight, it's pretty necessary to live. So, of course, then I had to learn the language whilst being here. But yeah, it was just a few situations that all occurred at once. And it was more of a, why not? And then haven't left since.
Why not? Yeah, great. And because you've got that perspective in Germany, then, do you see a difference in terms of research approach, teaching approaches, university approaches generally?
Yeah, I would definitely say there are some differences. I'd say in Germany, for example, it's much more structured and formal. So, for example, this is a little bit different than sports science, but it's very hierarchical. And you would a lot of times call someone doctor, someone in a class. So it'd be Dr. Julian, unless you say it's fine to call me Ross, for example. And it can be quite hierarchical in the way that it works. Also, when it comes to research, they have a very strong emphasis on precision and documentation, which is great, but also very much on data privacy and all of these things, very rigorous and strong, and which I think is really beneficial. But yeah, very detailed orientated and very systematic and very to the letter the way things are. And PhDs have a certain role, postdocs have a certain role, professors have a certain role. And I felt when I was in the UK, although I didn't do my PhD in the UK, but when I did my master's and whatnot, I felt it was a lot more, how can I say this? You could talk well with the professors, you had good rapport, it felt more open, and you didn't have such a hierarchical status. I think they both offer their strengths and weaknesses in that regard, but being from both, I think gives me a good mix of discipline and flexibility. But these are some things that I noticed in terms of the differences.
I've noticed a drive, obviously, because I'm in this area on women's sport. I've noticed a drive in the UK on doing things like menstrual cycle, but just generally on women's sport and exercise. Is that the same case in Germany? Has there been a natural increase?
Yeah, so I would definitely say yes, but I would say it came a little bit later. So it's been driven very much so. You see it in the US, Australia, UK. It very put into the forefront, and obviously it's been a great big nice boom, and there's been lots of research in women's sports, women athletes, and supporting women in general, which is awesome. And then Germany is now doing it. We're having a lot of research and trying to reduce that gender gap, etc. But I think it's just came a little bit later than the UK, so it's now more in the forefront. And I think when I started my PhD in 2013, it was something I hadn't seen in Germany too much when I was there looking at elite sport, menstrual cycle, etc. Again, as we mentioned at the beginning. So I'd say yes, it definitely is increasing a lot in Germany, but just happened a little bit delayed compared to the UK, in my opinion.
Ross, it's been such a pleasure to chat to you because I've never talked to you before, not face to face. I've emailed you probably a lot. So it's lovely. And you've provided such a lovely holistic picture of you, Germany, your lifestyle, what you're doing in the future. I've loved it. So thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast.
No, thank you, Jackie, for the invite. It's been a pleasure. And like you said, we shared a lot of emails, but never spoken. So it's great to finally actually meet you.